For years, a wealthy mother battling advanced Alzheimer's sat in silence inside her family's massive estate, unable to recognize anyone. Not even her only son, a billionaire who had once vanished under mysterious circumstances. Dozens of doctors, nurses, and therapists tried to reach her, but nothing worked. Then one day, a quiet new maid joined the staff. Someone nobody paid much attention to at first. She didn't ask questions, didn't cause problems. She simply observed. But what no one knew was that she was hiding a secret. And when the moment came, she walked up to the old woman, leaned down, and whispered just 5 simple words into her ear. And that changed everything. Before we continue with this story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and like the video. Oh, and don't forget to comment below where you're watching us from. We love to know that. At the top of a lonely hill in Charleston stood the large Holloway mansion. From the outside, the building looked perfect, its white walls clean, windows polished, and the front garden still well trimmed. But inside, the house told a different story. The halls were quiet and the rooms felt empty, even though people still worked there. The silence wasn't peaceful. It felt heavy, as if the walls were keeping secrets. Eleanor Holloway, once called the Lady of the South, lived there, but she wasn't the same. She had Alzheimer's, and her mind was lost in broken memories. Most days, she sat in a chair near the cold fireplace, staring into nothing. She whispered strange things to herself like, "Don't sign it," or "He fell in the lake and blue tie." No one understood what she meant. The staff didn't talk much, and they didn't go near her unless they had to. The woman in charge, Judith, kept everything under strict control. Judith had worked at Holloway Mansion for many years. She wasn't friendly, but she was organized. She made sure the mansion ran smoothly, no matter what. Every staff member had a job, and if they didn't do it right, Judith would notice. She didn't allow gossip or questions. That was especially true when it came to Eleanor's son, Thomas Holloway. Years ago, he had been the center of attention in the family. Everyone expected him to take over everything. But then, something strange happened. A big scandal involving Thomas shook the family, but no one ever said what it was. He disappeared not long after, and since then, no one had heard from him. People guessed what happened, but no one dared to say anything out loud. In the mansion, Thomas's name was never spoken. It was like he had vanished from existence. Judith made sure that rule was followed strictly, and no one dared to break it. The mansion seemed frozen in time. The days passed slowly, always the same. The morning started with quiet cleaning, soft footsteps on wooden floors, and no laughter or loud voices. The staff moved carefully, afraid of disturbing the stillness. Even though the mansion was big and beautiful, it felt more like a museum than a home. Old paintings covered the walls, and everything looked expensive, but also untouched, like no one really lived there anymore. At lunch, Eleanor was brought food, but she hardly ate. Most of the time, she just stared out the window or mumbled about things from the past. Her words didn't make sense, but there was always a feeling that something important was hidden in them. Sometimes she repeated herself again and again, especially when she mentioned the lake or a document. The workers began to feel uneasy. It was as if Eleanor was trying to tell them something, but they didn't understand what it was or how to help. Even though the mansion was full of valuable things, art, antiques, fine furniture, nothing felt warm or welcoming. The lights were kept low and curtains were often closed. The only real sound came from the ticking clocks in every hallway. Eleanor's room had pictures of her younger self, smiling in old dresses with her husband and a little boy, probably Thomas. But that happy life was long gone. No visitors ever came, and the phone rarely rang. The mansion, once full of guests and music, now stood like a quiet ghost of its past. Judith walked through the house every day with a clipboard in her hand, checking on everyone and everything. No one dared to ask her questions. When a light bulb went out or a window creaked, it was fixed quickly. But no one could fix the feeling in the air, the sense that something terrible had happened and it hadn't been dealt with. Then one morning, without any warning or announcement, a new worker arrived. She was young, with calm eyes and quiet steps. She didn't say much, and Judith didn't explain who she was. The staff only knew her name and that she was there to help. Some of the older workers exchanged glances but said nothing. It was strange for someone new to be hired, especially with no explanation. Usually hiring took time and involved careful decisions. This felt different. The new woman was assigned to help in general areas, especially with Eleanor. It was a difficult job. Most people didn't like being near Eleanor for long. Her constant whispering and strange behavior made them uncomfortable, but the new worker didn't seem bothered. She listened when Eleanor spoke and stayed close without fear. It was like she had a reason for being there, something more than just a job, but no one knew what it was. Her presence slowly changed the atmosphere in the mansion, even if just a little. Some of the staff began to act less tense when she was around. She treated everyone kindly, even Judith, who normally didn't accept friendliness. Still, the mansion remained a place full of mystery. Eleanor continued to speak in broken thoughts, but the new worker didn't ignore them. She started writing things down. Phrases like "don't sign it" or "blue tie" seemed strange, but she kept notes. Some days, Eleanor would grow more agitated, and other days she would be calm. The new woman stayed close during those moments, watching and waiting. It was clear she was trying to understand something. Judith noticed her too. She watched from a distance, keeping track, just like she always did. Life in the mansion didn't change overnight, but with the arrival of the new worker, something had begun. No one talked about it openly. But inside those old walls, the silence had started to shift. Grace Williams arrived at the Holloway mansion without making a scene. She came in through the side entrance early in the morning, carrying only one small bag. Judith, the strict house manager, introduced her as the new house helper and said nothing more. Grace looked young, maybe in her mid-20s. She wore plain clothes and didn't smile much. She nodded politely, spoke very little, and kept her eyes lowered. Most of the staff didn't pay much attention to her at first. Judith gave her one clear warning right away. Stay away from the old lady. She doesn't know who she is anymore. Grace didn't say anything in return, just nodded again. She was given simple cleaning tasks, sweeping, dusting, helping in the kitchen. She followed orders exactly. But from the very beginning, Grace was doing more than just her job. She was watching. She paid attention to every person, every hallway, and every word spoken when people thought no one was listening. Quietly, she started taking notes. Grace kept a small notebook hidden in her pocket. When no one was around, she would take it out and quickly write down anything she heard or noticed. She didn't want anyone to see it. Most of the time, she made notes about things Eleanor said. The older woman never really looked at Grace directly, but every time Grace entered the room, Eleanor became more restless. She moved in her chair, fidgeted with her hands, and whispered even more than usual. Grace never asked her anything, but she listened closely. Eleanor said strange things like, "piano hidden," "blue station." My hand shook. None of it made sense, but Grace wrote it all down. She also started to watch the other employees, who took breaks too often, who avoided Eleanor's room, who stayed too quiet when Thomas's name came up. Grace didn't rush. She acted like she belonged there, but her real job had nothing to do with cleaning the floors. Behind her calm face, Grace was focused and careful. She didn't make friends with the other workers. When they chatted in the kitchen, she listened but didn't join in. When they asked where she was from or how she got the job, she answered simply, "Agency sent me." That was enough to stop their questions. But the truth was very different. Grace hadn't come from any agency. She had been sent by someone important, someone powerful, who needed answers about the Holloway family. She had trained for this kind of work, gathering information without being noticed. Her job was to get close to Eleanor, to observe the house, and to find out what happened all those years ago when Thomas disappeared. Grace didn't know everything, but she knew enough to stay alert. She was told that the mansion held secrets, and Eleanor might be the only one left who knew the truth. Her mind was broken, but pieces of the past still came through in her words. Every day, Grace followed the routine. She cleaned the second-floor hallway, helped in the laundry room, and brought fresh towels to the guest rooms. But she always found time to pass by Eleanor's sitting room. Sometimes she entered with a feather duster and pretended to tidy up. Other times, she just stood near the door, waiting to hear something useful. She never pushed. She let Eleanor speak on her own. The older woman talked to herself often, but her tone changed when Grace was near. There was tension, like Eleanor felt something familiar. One afternoon, Eleanor stared straight at Grace for the first time and whispered, "You're not her, but you look like her." Grace didn't react. She just kept dusting, then left the room. That night, she wrote the words down. She didn't know who her was, but it mattered. Each piece mattered. Grace believed that the more she listened, the more sense the puzzle would make. Judith, however, began to grow suspicious. She noticed how Grace moved around the house, how often she was near Eleanor's room, and how quiet she stayed. Judith wasn't a fool. She had worked in the Holloway mansion for a long time. She had seen strange things before, and she didn't like surprises. One morning, Judith stopped Grace in the hallway and stared at her for a few seconds. "You're very curious for someone who just sweeps the floor," she said. Grace replied calmly, "I follow my list, ma'am. I go where I'm assigned." Judith said nothing more, but from that day on she kept an eye on Grace. Still, Grace didn't back down. She had a mission, and she wasn't going to stop. She continued her work, writing notes in secret, waiting for Eleanor to reveal something important. She knew she had to be careful. If Judith found out the truth, things could get dangerous. But Grace had come too far to turn back. Nobody in the mansion knew who Grace really was. To them, she was just a quiet helper doing her job. But Grace had been sent there with a very specific goal. She was told that something happened in that house, a decision, a lie, a disappearance. The answers were there, buried in the rooms, in people's memories, and mostly inside Eleanor's broken mind. Grace had to stay patient. She couldn't reveal her real reason for being there, not yet. Her work had just begun, and she knew the hardest part was still ahead. She believed that one of Eleanor's strange phrases would lead her to the truth. Maybe it was the blue station, maybe the piano, or maybe something still unspoken, but she wouldn't leave until she found it. And she wasn't alone. Someone powerful was waiting for answers. That person trusted Grace to get them, so she kept cleaning, listening, and writing. No one knew the truth. Grace was not just a maid. She was there on a mission. Grace was getting closer to Eleanor day by day. She didn't force anything or ask direct questions. Instead, she just sat nearby, pretending to clean or organize things, and waited quietly. She listened to every word Eleanor whispered. Sometimes Eleanor talked to herself for long periods. Other times, she held things in her hands like they were people. Once, she grabbed a small radio and smiled. "Tommy, you're back?" she said to the silent device. The other workers laughed when they heard things like that. They called Eleanor crazy behind her back, but Grace didn't laugh. She paid attention. She noticed Eleanor repeated certain names and phrases. They didn't seem random. Grace started to think Eleanor was trying to communicate something important, even if her mind was broken. Grace kept track of these moments in her notebook. She didn't speak much to anyone else in the house. She acted like a quiet helper, but inside she was slowly collecting clues that might lead her to the truth. Over time, Grace noticed specific reactions from Eleanor whenever certain objects or sounds were nearby. One day, while organizing a shelf, Grace placed a small porcelain horse near Eleanor's chair. Eleanor stared at it for almost a full minute and whispered, "That was in his room." Grace didn't move or speak. She just listened. These kinds of small reactions were becoming more frequent. It wasn't just random talk anymore. It was like Eleanor's memories were hidden deep, but certain things could bring pieces of them back. Grace focused on this. She began looking around the mansion more when she was alone. Late at night or during times when staff were busy elsewhere, she would explore. The house was full of locked doors and dusty storage rooms. One afternoon in a back hallway, she found stairs leading to the basement. No one ever mentioned the basement. It was dark, filled with boxes, old furniture, and things no one had touched in years. That's where Grace found something unusual. In the basement, Grace discovered a stack of old sheet music tucked away in a wooden crate. The papers were yellow and fragile, but still readable. They weren't just regular music notes. Handwritten notes were scribbled across the pages, phrases like, "Don't let him in," "Not before the rain," and "Blue before night." Grace sat down on the cold floor and read each one carefully. It was strange. The notes didn't make sense right away, but she had seen Eleanor mumble some of those same words. They were connected. Someone had written them years ago, and now Eleanor was repeating them without knowing. Grace took the sheets and hid them in her room. She knew they were important. If Judith or anyone else found them, she'd have no way to explain. She returned to the basement the next day and kept looking. Behind a cabinet, she found a locked closet. It took her a few days, but eventually she managed to get it open without being noticed. Inside the locked closet, Grace found only a few items, but they were strange. There was a dark blue tie, neatly folded, and a coat that smelled like lavender. She picked it up and brought it close to her face. The scent was strong, and she recognized it. It was the same smell Eleanor sometimes mentioned during her confused moments. Once, Eleanor had said, "He wore lavender, always lavender," while staring at the window. Grace placed the tie and coat back exactly as they were and locked the closet again. She didn't take them, but now she knew where they were if she needed them. After this discovery, she decided to test something. The next morning, when she helped bring Eleanor to her chair, she wore a small strip of blue fabric tied around her wrist. Eleanor looked at it and froze for a second. Then she whispered, "He's here." Grace didn't react, but deep down, she knew she was on the right path. Grace never told anyone what she was doing. She kept her real reason for being there a secret. Every time she learned something new, she became more careful. Judith was already watching her closely. One of the kitchen workers had mentioned that Judith didn't trust her, but Grace kept calm. She continued with her chores, stayed polite, and never acted nervous. Her mission wasn't finished yet. She believed that Eleanor held the answers. Somewhere inside all the confusion, there was a truth waiting to come out. It was just a matter of triggering the right memories. Grace kept a careful schedule. She only checked the hidden closet when no one was around, and she wrote down all reactions Eleanor had during the day. It was like piecing together a broken puzzle. Every day, she got a little closer. She knew she couldn't make a mistake. If anyone found out what she was really doing, she'd be thrown out, and then everything would be lost. Grace was now sure that Eleanor was the key to understanding what had happened in the past. The sheet music, the hidden coat, the blue tie, they were all part of a bigger picture. Eleanor wasn't just a confused old woman. She had lived through something important, something that had been hidden for years. Grace started to see a pattern in the way Eleanor repeated her words. It was almost like a code, built out of old emotions and faded memories. But time was running out. Judith was asking more questions. Some of the other workers had started watching Grace more closely too. Every step she took had to be careful and planned. She couldn't afford to be careless. Grace knew the truth was close. She could feel it. But she also knew one mistake could destroy everything. She had to stay focused. Eleanor was trying to speak through the silence, and Grace had to listen before it was too late and someone stopped her for good. While cleaning the locked office casually, Grace found a way to enter without drawing attention. The door was usually sealed, and only Judith had the key. But Grace had picked up on the routine. Judith always left the key on her desk during lunch. One day, while Judith was away, Grace entered the office. She moved quickly but carefully, touching nothing unless necessary. On the back of the leather chair, she saw a dark brown jacket with the initials TH stitched inside. She carefully pulled a few loose hairs from the collar and put them in a small plastic bag she had prepared earlier. Later that night, when no one was watching, she took a few strands from Eleanor's brush too. Grace wasn't guessing anymore. She wanted proof. She sent the samples to a trusted contact outside the mansion, someone who owed her a favor. While she waited for the results, she stayed quiet and acted normal. No one suspected that Grace was running a DNA test in secret. Days later, her contact sent a message with the results. The DNA samples matched. The man who had worn the jacket was indeed Eleanor Holloway's biological son. Grace held the paper tightly in her hand, staring at the result. There was no doubt anymore. Thomas Holloway had been in that house. But the question was, where was he now? And why had no one searched for him? Why did everyone in the mansion act like he never existed? Grace knew this wasn't normal. A family like the Holloways would never let a son disappear quietly unless someone had something to hide. The answer had to be buried deep. Grace continued her search through the old sheet music in the basement. She found more handwritten notes and markings. Some lines had small codes, and others had names and dates. It was confusing, but one sheet stood out. It mentioned a place and a date that didn't match any known event. Grace began to suspect the clues pointed to a hidden journal. Following the hints, Grace searched the back of the music cabinet. Inside a false bottom, she discovered a small leather-bound journal. It was old, with worn pages, and the handwriting was shaky but clear. The entries described Eleanor's thoughts during a difficult time. Several pages talked about Thomas being too emotional and unstable, but one entry shocked Grace. It explained how Eleanor was pressured into signing documents for Thomas to be taken away for treatment. The words used were polite, but the meaning was clear. Thomas had been forcibly committed to a mental clinic. Grace's heart pounded. This wasn't a story about a son who ran away. It was about someone being hidden on purpose. She made copies of the journal pages and kept the original hidden again. Now she had a new task: find out where Thomas had been taken and if he was still there. She started making calls to contacts she hadn't spoken to in years. Grace wasn't just a maid. She had experience, training, and people who owed her favors. She used an old contact from her time before Holloway Mansion, someone who worked with private clinics and records. After giving limited details, Grace got a list of possible facilities. Most were dead ends, but one name stood out: a clinic far outside Charleston, hidden in the woods under tight privacy laws. After more digging, she discovered something strange. A man matching Thomas Holloway's description had been there for years, but under a different name. Grace didn't waste time. She sent her contact to the clinic, pretending to be a relative. The man inside had no visitors, no records of family, and used the name Edward Halston. But when shown a photo of a young Thomas, the patient reportedly became quiet, then whispered, "Mother?" That was enough for Grace. Thomas Holloway was alive. Someone had locked him away. And now she knew it wasn't an accident. Someone powerful made sure he stayed forgotten. Grace returned to the mansion with this heavy truth on her shoulders. She walked through the halls like normal, doing her duties, But inside, she was filled with urgency. She couldn't tell anyone. She didn't know who to trust. She needed more proof, more pieces. The person who hid Thomas had influence and had to be close. That night, while Eleanor was sitting by the fireplace, Grace quietly entered and sat near her. She didn't speak. Eleanor looked restless and confused. She held her hands tightly and muttered to herself. Suddenly, she said, "The signature. It was her. They made me forget." Grace stayed still. Those words were different. It wasn't nonsense. Eleanor wasn't just lost in her mind anymore. She was remembering. Grace took out her notebook and carefully wrote it down. Who was her, she thought. Eleanor's voice faded back into mumbling, but the moment had passed. For Grace, it wasn't confusion. It was a revelation. She knew she was getting closer to the full truth. Everything was falling into place. Grace had confirmed Thomas was Eleanor's son. She had found evidence of a forced commitment, and now Eleanor was saying things that hinted she had been manipulated. Grace didn't know exactly who "her" referred to, but she had a few guesses. Judith had always been in control of the house. She had power, access, and no real warmth for Eleanor or Thomas. Could it be her, or someone else in the family's circle? Grace didn't have all the answers, but she was closer than ever. She knew time was short. If someone found out what she knew, they would stop her. Thomas was alive, but trapped under a fake identity. Eleanor was trying to remember, but her moments of clarity were rare and short. Grace needed to move fast. She needed to expose the truth before it disappeared again. And now, she finally understood one thing for sure. The key to everything was Eleanor Holloway herself. She just had to keep listening. Behind the scenes, Grace kept working quietly. While everyone else thought she was just cleaning, she was digging deeper. Over time, she discovered that Judith was not just a strict house manager. She was hiding something much bigger. Grace had learned how to move around the mansion without being noticed. She studied Judith's schedule and found out when the office would be empty. Inside one of the desks, Grace found a locked drawer. She picked the lock carefully and found flash drives, papers, and blueprints of the mansion. She took the flash drives to her contact in town and asked for help. When the files were opened, they revealed something shocking. Hidden cameras were installed in several rooms, even in places where cameras were not allowed. There were also fake financial reports and altered donation records from the Holloway Foundation. Judith had been stealing money and changing documents to cover her tracks. Grace finally saw the real reason why Thomas had disappeared years ago. Among the files was a video recorded over a decade ago. The footage showed a younger Thomas Holloway standing in the Foundation's office, visibly upset. He was arguing with someone off-screen. Then Judith entered the frame. Thomas pointed at her and said, "You think no one will find out? I'll go public. I'll take this to the board." He was shaking with anger. Judith didn't look scared. She looked annoyed. Moments later, two large men came in and grabbed Thomas by the arms. He shouted something else, but the audio cut off. Grace watched the clip several times. That moment explained everything. Thomas had found out about Judith's fraud, and she had shut him down fast. Grace copied the video and stored it on multiple drives. Now she understood why Thomas had been sent away. He wasn't sick. He was silenced. Back at the mansion that same day, Eleanor had a breakdown. She shouted Judith's name over and over, mixing it with strange phrases and dates. Eleanor's episode was intense. She was shaking and crying, sitting in her chair with her hands clutching a photo. Grace came in and tried to calm her, but Eleanor wouldn't stop. "She didn't let me see Judith. Tommy fell in the dark room," she cried. Grace stayed by her side, taking notes mentally, trying to catch every word. It was clear that Eleanor's mind was trying to reach the truth. She was confused, but her words weren't random. "The papers. She said I had to sign it, but I didn't want to. Grace knew she was talking about Judith. Eleanor had been manipulated into signing documents that led to Thomas's forced disappearance. Now, everything was clearer. Judith had power over Eleanor, control over the staff, and no one ever questioned her authority. Grace realized she had to act fast. She organized all the evidence she had, videos, files, and notes, and made copies. She tried to call the police using a secure number provided by her contact. But something went wrong. The call didn't go through as expected. Instead, after dialing the number, the line suddenly cut off, and the phone shut down. Moments later, Judith entered the room where Grace had been hiding to make the call. Her face was red with anger. In front of 2 other staff members, she shouted, "You've been stealing! I found things missing. Personal items. Records." Grace stood silently, saying nothing. Judith's voice got louder, accusing her of betrayal and bad behavior. Then she told the 2 staff members to escort Grace off the property. They grabbed her by the arms and led her outside. Staff members watched from windows and hallways as Grace was taken out. No one said a word. Judith followed close behind, still yelling, but Grace didn't look afraid. She walked out calmly, and as she reached the front gate, she turned her head slightly and smiled. Not a big smile, just a quiet, knowing one. Something had changed. Judith no longer had full control. Grace wasn't broken. Being kicked out didn't stop her. In fact, it gave her more freedom. While living inside the mansion, she had to hide everything. Now, she didn't have to play by those rules anymore. She already had backups of all the files. She had the video, the fake bank reports, and Eleanor's statements written down. She had sent copies to people she trusted. And now that she was out, she could take action without anyone watching her every move. Judith had made a mistake. She thought removing Grace would solve the problem, but it only made things worse for her. Grace had waited patiently, gathering everything. She had put all the pieces of the puzzle together. She knew Thomas was alive, Eleanor had been silenced, and Judith was behind it all. Her time inside the mansion was over, but the real work was just beginning. The next step would take place outside those walls. Grace had the truth, and she was ready to use it. As she walked away from the mansion, the large building behind her looked the same as ever. But now, Grace saw it differently. She had entered that house as a quiet worker. No one had paid attention to her. Now, she was leaving with all the secrets that the Holloway family had buried. She didn't know what Judith would do next. Maybe destroy more evidence, maybe try to cover her tracks, but it didn't matter anymore. Grace was ahead. She didn't need permission. She didn't need to pretend. Everything Judith tried to hide was already in motion. People would see the truth. The authorities would get involved. Thomas could be freed. Eleanor could finally be believed. Grace had done what no one else dared to do. She had turned the game around. And as she disappeared down the road with her small bag, leaving the mansion behind, her calm smile remained. Judith had won for years, but not anymore. The rules had changed, and Grace was the one in control now. Outside the mansion, everything changed. Grace was no longer pretending. She finally revealed her true identity to the world. She wasn't just a quiet housemaid. She was a trained nurse and undercover investigator. She had been working secretly under the direction of George Keller, a close friend of Thomas Holloway and a former member of the original Holloway Foundation board. George had suspected something was wrong for years. He knew Judith was hiding something, but never had the evidence to prove it. That's when he contacted Grace. With her background in nursing and investigative work, she was the perfect person to enter the mansion unnoticed and find out the truth. And she did exactly that. Now, with video footage, DNA tests, and detailed notes from inside the house, Grace helped George prepare a full report. They didn't keep it quiet. They took it directly to the press. They wanted the world to see what had happened inside Holloway Mansion. No more silence. No more secrets. The reaction was immediate. News outlets picked up the story within hours. Headlines appeared everywhere. Missing billionaire found alive after years in secret facility, and Holloway scandal, corruption, silence, and one brave investigator. TV reporters gathered outside the clinic where Thomas was being held. Lawyers showed up. Government officials got involved. People wanted answers. The public was shocked. The idea that a rich and powerful man had been hidden away for so long, with no one asking questions, was unbelievable. Grace and George held a press conference where they explained everything. They showed the video of Thomas being dragged out of the office. They showed the DNA test results and financial documents proving fraud. They made it clear this wasn't just a family problem. It was a crime. Soon after, a legal order was issued to remove Thomas from the private clinic. Medical staff cooperated, and Thomas was carefully transferred to a recovery center. He was weak, confused, and disoriented, but he was finally free. When Thomas was brought out, cameras flashed. He looked older, thinner, and tired, but his eyes moved as if trying to remember something. A nurse asked his name. He hesitated, then whispered, "Thomas." That one word confirmed everything. Grace visited him quietly, and when she said names like Judith and Eleanor, he reacted. At first, it was only facial expressions, but slowly he started repeating words. The room, piano, Mum's voice. Grace showed him photographs and pages from the journal. His hands shook when he held them, but he didn't let go. Some memories were still inside, even if blurry. Every time someone said Holloway Mansion, his breathing changed. He remembered the house. He remembered arguing with Judith. He remembered trying to speak out and being silenced. Doctors said his mind needed time to heal, but he was aware. He knew his name. He knew someone had taken his life away. And now he wanted to understand what had happened and why no one came for him until now. Meanwhile, inside Holloway Mansion, chaos was spreading. Staff had seen the news and didn't know what to believe. Some were scared, others were angry. But one person reacted with intense emotion: Eleanor Holloway. That afternoon, while walking through the hallway, she suddenly stopped in front of an old lamp. She grabbed it tightly with both arms, hugged it against her chest, and started to cry. "He's back! He's back! The piano is still here!" she shouted. A caretaker tried to calm her, but she wouldn't stop. Her voice echoed through the house. Her words weren't just noise anymore. She sounded sure. She sounded awake. Other workers stood by in silence, watching. They didn't laugh. They didn't whisper. They knew something real was happening. It was like Eleanor's mind was connecting the past and present all at once. Her broken memory, after years of confusion, was giving her one clear message. Her son had returned. Even in her condition, she could feel the truth. Judith, however, was no longer untouchable. Investigators were already on their way to question her. Members of the foundation board called emergency meetings. People started asking hard questions. Why had no one looked into Thomas's disappearance before? Why was Judith given full control for so many years? Why were donations and finances never reviewed properly? Judith tried to defend herself. She claimed she had acted out of concern, that Thomas had been unstable and dangerous, but the evidence told a different story. The documents Grace found showed lies, hidden bank transfers, and secret decisions made without Eleanor's full awareness. The video of Thomas being taken by force was impossible to explain. Judith lost her temper during one interview and walked out. Her calm, professional image was falling apart. No one trusted her anymore. The people around her began to back away. Some resigned from their jobs, others refused to speak. Judith realized she was running out of support. Her grip on the Holloway family was breaking fast. Everyone could feel that something big was about to happen. The lies were being exposed. The truth, once buried and hidden behind locked doors and fake documents, was now out in the open. Grace had finished her part inside the mansion, but her mission wasn't over. She continued working with legal teams and doctors helping Thomas recover. She also visited Eleanor when she could, though from a distance. Judith had not yet been arrested, but her power was gone. The story had reached every major news channel. People around the country followed the updates. The Holloway name, once respected, was now tied to scandal. But the most important thing was clear. The truth had come back, just like Thomas, and even though he still had a long road ahead, he was no longer forgotten. At the mansion, staff whispered less and listened more. Everyone waited. No one knew what would happen next. But one thing was certain: Judith was losing, and this time she couldn't stop it. Thomas Holloway returned to the mansion after many years. He was no longer the confident young man from the past. His steps were slow, and his face showed years of confusion and pain. But his eyes held something new: determination. He was ready to face what had been taken from him. The mansion looked the same from the outside, but inside it felt different. He walked through the front doors with Grace by his side. The hallways felt cold. The furniture was still there, the same paintings on the wall, but he barely recognized anything. Judith was gone now, removed from her position, under investigation. The staff avoided eye contact, unsure how to act. Some were still in shock that Thomas was alive. Eleanor sat in her usual chair, silent, staring into space. When Thomas spoke softly to her, she didn't react, not even a blink. It hurt more than he expected, but he knew he had to try. He wasn't here to give up, not again. Grace had been officially allowed back into the mansion. She wasn't pretending anymore. Her documents were cleared, and her job was recognized legally, though no one knew her full story except Thomas. The staff had been told she was returning to assist with Thomas's reintegration and to support Eleanor. But to the others, she was still just a nurse with special clearance. Grace didn't explain. She focused on helping Thomas settle back in. Together they walked through the house, and Grace pointed out parts of the past, rooms that might help him remember. When they reached the second floor, they stood in front of an old wooden door. Thomas looked at it for a long time before opening it. It was his childhood bedroom. Dust covered everything. The shelves were empty, and the drawers were full of old papers. Grace suggested they clean and rebuild it together, step by step. Thomas agreed. If there was a way to reach his mother, it had to start here. Over the next few days, Thomas and Grace worked carefully to restore the room. They found old photo albums in storage, some toys, old records and books that had been packed away years ago. Grace helped wash the old sheets and set up the bed again. Thomas chose the same curtains he had as a child. They brought back a record player and found a few vinyl discs of songs Eleanor used to play. The scent of his old cologne was still in a drawer, faint but recognizable. Grace found a small perfume bottle that once belonged to Eleanor. They placed it near the mirror. Every detail was done with care. Thomas didn't speak much during the process. He was focused, and when he wasn't working, he was thinking. Grace guided the setup, making sure everything matched what Eleanor would remember. They weren't just fixing a room. They were building a memory, something strong enough to help Eleanor feel something again. It was their last hope. When the room was finally ready, Thomas stood at the doorway and stared. It looked almost identical to how it had been when he was young. The light, the furniture, the clothes, even the music, it was all there. Grace walked down the hall and gently told the staff that Eleanor should be brought in. 2 caretakers helped her up slowly from her chair and guided her toward the room. Eleanor walked with small steps, her hands shaking, her face blank. She didn't say anything. When she crossed the doorway and stepped inside, something changed. She stopped. Her head turned slightly. Her eyes scanned the space slowly, though they didn't lock onto anything specific. She didn't speak. Thomas stood quietly in the corner, wiping a tear from his face. He didn't expect a miracle, but he hoped for a sign. Eleanor continued standing there, in silence. Grace gave Thomas a nod. It was time to try. They had done everything they could to prepare for this moment. Grace approached Eleanor with calm and care. She gently took the older woman's hand and led her slowly toward the center of the room. Thomas stayed still, barely breathing, watching everything. Grace helped Eleanor sit in the old chair by the window, where she used to read. Then Grace opened the drawer where they had placed the blue tie, the one Thomas used to wear and the one Eleanor had always remembered in her whispers. She picked it up, walked over, and softly placed it in Eleanor's lap. Eleanor didn't look at it right away. Her hands rested beside it. Grace waited a moment, then knelt beside her and whispered something softly into her ear. The room stayed silent. Thomas leaned forward slightly, unable to hear what she said. Grace repeated the words, clearer this time, but only for Eleanor. The staff stood in the hallway, watching from a distance. No one moved. No one knew what would happen, but they all waited in quiet anticipation. Then it happened, small, but real. Eleanor moved her hand and touched the blue tie. Her fingers felt the fabric slowly. Her eyes shifted downward, landing on it for a moment. Her lips parted slightly, and her head turned toward Thomas. It wasn't a full moment of clarity, but it was different from before. She looked at him, not through him, but at him. A soft sound escaped her mouth. "Tommy?" It was barely a whisper, but Thomas heard it. He took one step forward, tears falling from his eyes. Grace stayed by Eleanor's side, calm and steady. She had said the 5 words, "He never stopped loving you." That was all it took. Not magic, not a miracle, just something real, something human. Eleanor didn't speak again, but the silence felt different now. It was no longer empty. It was full of something they hadn't felt in years. Hope. Thomas knelt down beside her, holding her hand gently. He didn't speak either. He didn't need to. She was still there. Thomas was still on his knees beside his mother, holding her hand carefully. He didn't speak. He didn't want to break the fragile moment. Eleanor's eyes had finally moved. She had looked at him, not through him, not past him, but at him. That alone had been more than he expected. Grace stood a few feet away, silent, watching. She could feel something important was about to happen. She walked slowly toward Eleanor, stopping in front of her. She looked at Thomas, then looked at the woman who had once been called the Lady of the South. Grace closed her eyes, took a deep breath, and leaned in close. With a calm voice, almost like she was repeating an old phrase or unlocking a memory, she whispered, "Tommy is home, my love." The room went completely still. A quiet pause filled the air. No one moved. No one breathed. All eyes were on Eleanor, waiting, hoping, not knowing what would happen next. Eleanor didn't speak right away. She just blinked slowly, her lips slightly open. For a moment, it seemed like nothing had changed. Then, very gently, she raised her hand and touched Thomas's cheek. Her fingers were cold and shaking, but they reached him. Thomas held his breath. Eleanor stared at him closely, like her mind was searching through a fog, trying to find a name, a memory, a connection. Then it came. In a soft, broken voice, she said, "Tommy, my boy, you found the way." The words made Thomas cry openly. His tears dropped onto her lap as he leaned in to hold her. She opened her arms and hugged him. It wasn't weak or confused. It was strong, full of emotion, like her body had remembered how it felt to hold her son. The hug lasted for several seconds. Grace stepped back, giving them space. A few nurses at the door gasped. Some of the staff quietly began to cry as well. In the hallway, several journalists and medical staff had gathered once the news spread that Thomas was inside the house. Cameras had been kept outside, but a few reporters were allowed in under supervision. A neurologist, Dr. Reeves, was also present, monitoring Eleanor's condition for the Foundation's records. When she began speaking full sentences, he was shocked. "This kind of response is extremely rare," he said to a journalist. The brain, even when damaged, can sometimes access deeply emotional memories through very specific triggers. He explained that the combination of the restored room, the presence of Thomas, and the emotional phrase spoken by Grace may have worked together to unlock a part of Eleanor's memory. Inside the room, Eleanor was still speaking. Her voice was soft but clear. The music, the piano, she made me forget. Everyone listened quietly. She looked around the room like she was waking up after a long sleep. She saw the old records, the books, and the scent of lavender in the air. "She locked me in here," Eleanor said next. Her words were slow but sharp. Thomas held her hand tighter. Grace sat beside her now, writing everything down. Eleanor wasn't lost anymore. She was aware. She was back. She talked about how things had changed after her husband died. She remembered Judith being more controlling. "She didn't let me see the letters. She said Tommy had gone crazy," Eleanor said. Grace and Thomas looked at each other. This was more than memory. It was evidence. Eleanor was confirming everything they had suspected. Her mind was damaged, yes, but the truth had survived inside her, waiting for the right moment. Grace asked a quiet question. "Do you remember the papers she gave you to sign?" Eleanor nodded slowly. "I didn't want to, but she said I had to. She said it was for Tommy's protection." She looked down at the blue tie, still resting in her lap. "That's his tie. I ironed it for his first day." Thomas couldn't stop crying. Every word from Eleanor felt like a small piece of his childhood being returned. Grace gently guided Eleanor to rest against the chair, but the older woman didn't want to sleep. "Not now," she said. "I've been asleep for too long." Journalists outside asked for statements, but Grace and Thomas refused to speak publicly right away. This moment wasn't for cameras. It was personal. Dr. Reeves kept taking notes and asked if Eleanor wanted to listen to music. Thomas nodded and turned on the record player. A soft piano melody played. Eleanor closed her eyes, smiling. "That's the one," she whispered. "He used to play it in the living room, before everything went quiet." Grace held her notebook in her lap, but didn't write anymore. This wasn't about notes now. It was about being present. They had all waited for this moment, months, years, even decades. Now it was finally real. She was speaking. She remembered. She had returned. Eleanor leaned her head back against the chair. She looked tired, but not confused. She was calmer now. Thomas stayed beside her, holding her hand. Grace stood by the door, watching over them. Nobody interrupted. There were no orders, no medical tests, no more secrets. Just a mother and her son, together again. Eleanor looked at Thomas and smiled. "You didn't stop loving me," she said. Thomas nodded. "Never," he whispered. Grace quietly stepped out of the room, letting them have the moment. Outside, the air felt heavy with emotion. Reporters lowered their cameras. Even the staff moved slower, more respectfully. Back inside, Eleanor said one last thing before resting her eyes. "I remember now. Everything." For the first time in years, she sounded like herself. No confusion, no broken thoughts, just truth. It wasn't a miracle. It was love, memory, and 5 simple words that unlocked everything. "Tommy is home, my love." That was all it took. She had come back. For him. For real. Judith tried to escape the country. After the public exposure of her crimes, she packed her things and left the mansion quietly. She avoided contact with the remaining staff and didn't return any calls from legal authorities. Her plan was simple: disappear before the court process could begin. She arrived at the airport with a fake ID and a one-way ticket to a country without extradition. But she didn't make it far. Federal agents were already watching her. She was stopped at the boarding gate and arrested on the spot. Her face showed no emotion as she was handcuffed and taken away. The news broke within the hour. Cameras caught her being escorted out of the terminal. The headlines were clear. Former Holloway administrator caught trying to flee. In the courtroom, all the evidence Grace had collected was presented: financial fraud, forged documents, abuse of power, and threats. Witnesses came forward, including past employees. Judith was officially charged. Her control over the Holloway family was finally broken. After Judith's arrest, things moved quickly. The board of the Holloway Foundation voted to reinstate Thomas as the legal head. He had every right to return to his place. His father's legacy, his name, and his story were all connected to the foundation. At a press conference, Thomas stood at the front of the room with Grace by his side. The media expected him to speak about the scandal, but instead, he focused on the truth. He looked at Grace and said, "She was never just a housemaid. She was placed here by a silent hero. George Keller never gave up." Cameras clicked. Reporters leaned forward. Grace risked everything. Without her, none of this would have come to light, Thomas continued. He then announced that Grace would take on the new official role of Director of Well-Being for the Foundation. The room clapped. Grace stayed calm, but her eyes showed emotion. For the first time, the world saw who she really was. Smart, strong, and loyal to the truth. The press reaction was massive. Major outlets reported on Grace's secret identity, the conspiracy within the Holloway estate, and the role of George Keller. George was interviewed later that week. In a short statement, he said, "I couldn't sit by and watch a family be destroyed." Grace did the hard part. She gave Eleanor and Thomas their voices back. Meanwhile, life inside the mansion began to shift. Eleanor, though still ill, received better care. Thomas made sure only professionals and trusted people were around her. Grace helped set up a daily routine for Eleanor: music therapy, memory exercises, and quiet reading sessions. Some days were good. Eleanor would smile, say a few clear words, and even laugh. Other days were quiet or confused. But now, she wasn't alone. She had real care. She had love. Thomas visited her daily. He didn't expect miracles. He just wanted her to feel safe. For the first time in years, the mansion felt like a home again, not a prison controlled by fear. As life slowly rebuilt itself, another chapter reopened. Thomas reached out to his ex-wife, Margaret. They had lost contact years ago after Judith drove her away with lies and threats. Back then, Margaret had tried to fight, but no one listened to her. Judith made sure she was isolated, blamed for problems she didn't cause, and eventually forced her to leave for her own safety. Now, with Judith gone, Thomas wanted to see her again, not to fix the past, but to face it. They met in a quiet cafe. It was awkward at first. Margaret was cautious, unsure of his intentions, but Thomas spoke honestly. He apologized, he explained everything. They talked for hours. There were no promises of getting back together, but both left the meeting with peace. Thomas realized some things couldn't be undone, but they could be understood. Margaret thanked him for telling the truth. He thanked her for surviving it. Their story had changed, but respect remained. That was enough for now. Back at the mansion, life continued at a slow, steady pace. Grace focused on her new role, managing well-being programs both inside the mansion and through the Foundation's outreach projects. Her background in healthcare and investigation made her perfect for the job. She didn't sit behind a desk. She spent time with the staff, the residents, and most importantly, with Eleanor. One afternoon, Grace and Thomas were helping Eleanor with an old photo album. They sat close by, guiding her hand across the pages. Eleanor didn't speak much that day. She just listened. Then, as Grace helped adjust a blanket over Eleanor's lap, the older woman looked at both of them. For a moment, her eyes were sharp and clear. She smiled. "Love always comes back," she said softly, "even if it's in disguise." Grace looked at Thomas. He smiled too. Eleanor slowly returned her gaze to the photo in her lap. That sentence stayed with them, simple but true. It was a rare moment of clarity, and it meant everything. The house, once filled with fear, silence, and secrets, now carried something new. It wasn't perfect. There were still hard days, and some wounds would never fully heal, but the darkness that Judith created was gone. Grace walked the halls freely. Thomas worked from his office, running the foundation with honesty and purpose. Eleanor was never left alone. Nurses treated her like family. The staff respected her, and even though her mind faded in and out, she knew she was loved. The press moved on to new stories, but people still remembered what happened. The Holloway scandal became a case study in how power can be abused and how truth can survive, even when hidden. Grace never looked for fame. She continued her work quietly, focused on helping others. Thomas often joined her. The two of them had been through something few could understand. And as they stood side by side one evening, watching the lights of the mansion turn on, they knew one thing for sure. The worst was over. Months had passed since everything changed. The Holloway mansion no longer felt like a symbol of silence and pain. With careful planning and the support of the Holloway Foundation, the large estate was transformed into a specialized care center for Alzheimer's patients. The idea came from Thomas and Grace. After watching Eleanor's long struggle with the disease and how small, meaningful actions helped her reconnect, they wanted to create a space where others could experience that same care and dignity. The rooms were redesigned with safety and comfort in mind. Music therapy, memory-triggering objects, and quiet reflection areas were included in every corner. Some of Eleanor's favorite pieces, her books, her chair, and even old photographs, were placed in the main therapy room. Staff were carefully trained. Many had been handpicked by Grace herself. News spread quickly about the new center. Families from around the state began applying to move their loved ones there. The foundation's reputation grew stronger. People started calling it a place where memory is respected. Thomas and Grace stayed by her side every day. She had moments of confusion and long stretches of silence, but also rare flashes of calm and clarity. Grace often read to her or played soft piano music, while Thomas held her hand quietly. The staff cared for her with great respect, not just because of who she was, but because of what she had survived. Everyone knew Eleanor had been through more than just an illness. She had been manipulated, silenced, and hurt. But she had also found her way back, even if just for a short time. Her final days were peaceful. One morning, after a quiet night, Eleanor passed away in her sleep. She looked calm. Thomas was sitting beside her, and Grace had just finished adjusting the blanket over her legs. As the nurse checked her, Eleanor opened her eyes briefly and whispered, "Thank you for reminding me." Those were her final words. The funeral was simple, but deeply emotional. Close friends, foundation members, and staff attended. No cameras were allowed. This was a private farewell. The ceremony was held in the garden of the mansion, now a part of the new care center. A soft breeze passed through the trees as people took their seats. Thomas stood at the front, dressed in a dark suit. He looked at the crowd, then at the photo of his mother beside the casket. When he began speaking, his voice was steady. "My mother forgot the world," he said, "but she never forgot love, and that's what brought her back to us." Many people wiped away tears. Grace stood near him, holding a folded piece of paper, but she didn't speak. Her silence said enough. Thomas thanked everyone who had supported them through the hard times and spoke briefly about forgiveness, truth, and healing. Eleanor was then laid to rest in a quiet area of the estate, near the old piano room window she had loved. After the funeral, the atmosphere was calm. There was no media, no scandal, only closure. Grace stayed close to Thomas throughout the day. She wore a dark dress, walked with quiet confidence, and greeted the guests not as an assistant or staff member, but as someone truly important to the family's story. People saw her differently now. They remembered the reports, the investigation, the trial, but most of all, they remembered her quiet strength during the hardest moments. Her role was no longer hidden. Thomas made it clear to everyone. Grace had been the one who helped rebuild everything from the ground up. Over time, the connection between them grew stronger. It wasn't dramatic or rushed. They didn't make public declarations or big gestures. But it was clear to anyone who looked. Something was growing. A romance was blooming. It moved slowly, with trust and care, just like everything else that had happened inside those walls. There had been too much pain to rush anything. As the center grew in reputation, more families brought their loved ones. The staff expanded, programs were added, and donations increased. But even with all the changes, one thing remained at the heart of it all: the belief that love could bring people back. Grace spent her mornings reviewing cases and afternoons walking through the halls, checking on patients and speaking with staff. Thomas handled the foundation's finances and expansion plans, but made time every day to visit the center personally. Sometimes he sat in the music room, listening to recordings Eleanor once loved. Grace would join him. They didn't need to talk much. Their presence was enough. Everyone who worked there could feel that the place was special. It wasn't just a medical facility, it was a place of healing. Patients responded better than expected. Some remembered names. Others smiled for the first time in weeks. And through it all, the spirit of Eleanor Holloway, her struggle, her return, her strength, remained in every corner of the home. At the front of the center, right beside the main door, a small plaque was installed. Visitors saw it as soon as they arrived. Staff walked past it every day. It was made of dark wood, with silver letters carved carefully into the surface. It didn't mention dates or names. It didn't list achievements or titles. It simply said the words that had changed everything. The 5 words Grace had whispered when Eleanor first came back to herself. "Tommy is home, my love." Those 5 words had triggered a memory so deep that even Alzheimer's couldn't destroy it. They represented more than just a sentence. They were a symbol of return, of healing, of forgiveness. For Grace, those words meant she had fulfilled her mission. For Thomas, they meant he had brought his mother back before it was too late. And for everyone else, they served as a reminder. Love doesn't always come loudly, but when it comes, it stays. And sometimes it brings people home, no matter how far they've gone. Finally, we've reached the end of this story. I'm extremely happy that you've made it this far. Thank you very much for watching. Comment below what you thought and what was the best or worst part. Don't forget to subscribe. Until next time.